At exactly 2:17 a.m. in February of 1952, a nurse at St. Thomas Hospital in London froze in the hallway. She would later say she wasn't tired. She wasn't dreaming. She wasn't afraid until she realized something was standing at the end of the corridor, tall, black, and shaped like a man, but darker than the surrounding shadows. It didn't move. It watched. When she finally screamed, the figure was gone. No report was filed. No explanation was offered. And that is how most encounters with the unseen begin. Not with proof, but with silence. Because history is not only written by those who are believed, it is haunted by those who are not. Tonight, we're not talking about folklore, myths, or exaggerated legends. We are talking about recorded encounters, accounts separated by centuries and continents, yet bound by one impossible detail. People saw things that should not exist and described them in the same way. Long before modern psychology had words for hallucination, long before cinema shaped imagination, witnesses were already writing about entities that did not fit the natural world. In the year 412 CE, Roman historian Ammianus Marcellinus documented reports from soldiers stationed along the Rhine frontier. They spoke of dark human shapes that appeared near encampments at night, standing just beyond firelight, disappearing when approached. These were disciplined men, trained observers, veterans of war. Ammianus did not call them mad. He simply wrote that the sightings were unaccounted for. Centuries later, in medieval England, court records from Leicestershire between the 13th and 14th centuries describe villagers reporting a black, humanoid presence living in wooded areas. Something tall, thin, and watching from trees. The figure was referred to not as a spirit, but as a being. Witnesses testified under oath. Livestock vanished. Paths were avoided. The entity was not a story for children. It was a reason adults refused to travel after sunset. Then there is a detail historians often hesitate to mention. The descriptions never change. In 1692, during the Salem period in colonial America, long before the trials spiraled into hysteria, written account from settlers in nearby wilderness areas describe encounters with dark men without faces seen at the edge of forests. These accounts were dismissed later, folded into superstition. But at the time, they were logged as observations, not accusations. In 1811, in the English county of Devon, local newspapers reported something else entirely. Villagers spoke of small, upright creatures moving through fields at night. They were described as hairless, pale, with elongated limbs and unnatural movement, sometimes running on two legs, sometimes dropping to all fours. Attacks on livestock were documented. Fear spread across multiple towns. And then, without explanation, the sightings stopped. No carcasses, no tracks that made sense, no known species. Across the Atlantic, nearly a century and a half later, in August of 1955, the Sutton family in Hopkinsville, Kentucky called the police in a panic. Officers arrived to find a shaken household, insisting that small humanoid creatures had surrounded their farmhouse. These beings were described in police statements as having large, glowing eyes, thin limbs, and a metallic sheen to their skin. Shots had been fired. The family was not intoxicated. The officers found no evidence of a hoax. The case was never solved. What is often ignored is that similar descriptions existed long before 1955, long before science fiction films, long before the idea of aliens saturated popular culture. In the 1700s, French naturalist Charles-Marie de la Condamine documented reports from South America of little men of the forest who appeared suddenly, stared silently, and vanished without sound. He rejected folklore explanations and admitted, in writing, that he could not classify what witnesses were describing. And then there are the shadow beings. In 1886, neurologist Silas Weir Mitchell documented patients who reported seeing tall, human-shaped shadows during waking hours, not during sleep, not during illness. He dismissed none of them as insane. He simply noted that the experiences were consistent across unrelated individuals. That consistency becomes more disturbing when we move into the 20th century. During World War I, Soldiers in the trenches of France recorded sightings of dark figures standing between no man's land and the trenches. Figures that did not fire, did not attack, but watched. British war diaries reference these entities obliquely, often crossed out or minimized. Fear spreads faster than bullets in war. Some things are better left unspoken. In 1939, just months before the outbreak of World War II, residents of Freiburg, Germany reported a tall, shadow-like figure appearing repeatedly near rail yards and military installations. The sightings stopped after bombing began. No official comment was ever made. And then there is the Hat Man. The earliest written description appears not in modern psychology texts, but in an 18th-century German manuscript describing a dark gentleman with a broad hat who appeared at the bedside of the ill, not speaking, not touching, simply observing. Nearly 200 years later, people across North America, Europe, Africa, and Asia would describe the same figure, down to the silhouette. Same height, same hat, same stillness. This is where historians grow uncomfortable. Because hallucinations evolve. Stories change. Legends mutate. But these descriptions do not. In West and Central Africa, colonial-era medical reports from the late 1800s document patients reporting attacks by short humanoid entities during nighttime hours. European doctors dismissed cultural explanations until physical injuries were observed. Scratches, bruising, trauma with no visible attacker. These reports were quietly archived, never resolved. In the United States during the 1970s, forest rangers in multiple states filed internal reports describing encounters with pale, emaciated humanoid figures deep in national parks. These figures fled with speed inconsistent with known animals. The reports were not made public. They were categorized as anomalous wildlife behavior. That phrase appears again and again in government archives. Anomalous, unclassified, unresolved. Go further back, and the trail becomes colder, but no less consistent. Norse sagas from the 10th century mention encounters with tall, hostile humanoids described as red-haired, massive, and intelligent. Native American oral histories, recorded by anthropologists in the 1800s, tell of the same beings, giants who lived in caves, fought violently, and were eventually driven away or destroyed. Skeletal remains were reportedly found. Many were removed. Few were cataloged. History does not like what it cannot label. And then there are the mimics. In the 1940s, Canadian trappers reported hearing their names called from deep forests, voices identical to loved ones, calling from places no human could reach. Similar accounts appear in Siberian records, Australian bush reports, and modern military training incidents. The rule is always the same. If you answer the voice, something follows. No animal behavior explains this. By the late 20th century, these reports increased. Not because the entities appeared more often, but because more people wrote things down. Recorded interviews, audio logs, police calls, hospital reports, different centuries, different cultures, same impossible beings. And this is where history leaves us with an uncomfortable truth. Either humanity has been collectively hallucinating the same entities for over 2,000 years, or there are things moving at the edges of our world that do not need belief to exist. They do not announce themselves. They do not leave bodies behind. They do not stay long. They appear. They are seen. And they vanish, leaving history to argue over whether the witnesses were mistaken. But history remembers patterns. And these patterns suggest something watching from the dark, patient enough to wait centuries, consistent enough to be recognized, and silent enough to remain unnamed. So the question is no longer, do these entities exist? The question is far worse. Why do they let us see them at all? History teaches us dates, wars, and empires, but it rarely teaches us what watched from the shadows while those empires rose and fell. These accounts were written by people who did not know each other. They lived in different centuries. They spoke different languages. And yet, they described the same impossible beings with unsettling precision. Not legends, not campfire stories, but moments recorded, sworn, and remembered by people who had nothing to gain by lying. If even a fraction of these encounters are true, then the world we were taught to understand is incomplete. And perhaps the greatest mystery is not what these entities are, but why they choose silence over conquest, observation over contact. Because whatever watches without being seen does not need permission to exist. And if history has taught us anything, it's this. What humanity ignores does not disappear, it waits. If you believe some truths were buried, not forgotten, if you feel that history still hides its darkest chapters, then this channel was made for you. Subscribe to Dew of Dread for documented mysteries, forbidden history, and encounters that refuse to stay dead. And if you've ever seen something you couldn't explain, you're not alone. The shadows remember.